Eleanor Blackwood never expected that a tutor for her struggling son would become the most dangerous temptation of her perfectly controlled life. But when Dr. Oliver Williams rang her doorbell on that sweltering September afternoon, everything she thought she knew about desire was about to be completely rewritten. The marble foyer of her Beacon Hill mansion felt like a furnace despite the air conditioning, and Eleanor had just stepped from her second cold shower of the day when the doorbell chimed with aristocratic precision. She'd forgotten about the appointment entirely. Richard's business trip to Singapore had left her schedule in shambles, and Christopher's academic crisis had become another item on her endless list of problems to solve with money and connections. Wrapping her silk Hermes robe around her still damp body, Eleanor descended the curved staircase with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent 20 years performing elegance. The cool marble beneath her bare feet provided momentary relief from the heat that seemed to press against every window of the historic townhouse. She opened the heavy oak door, expecting the usual parade of over-educated white men who tutored the children of Boston's elite Tweedy professors with soft handshakes and softer voices, who treated her like an ornamental checkbook rather than the woman who'd built sterling capital from nothing. Instead, she found herself staring up at Dr. Oliver Williams, 6 feet of lean muscle wrapped in a charcoal suit that had been tailored to perfection, skin the color of rich espresso, and eyes that held the kind of intelligence that could strip away pretense with surgical precision. His smile was confident without being arrogant, it's professional without being cold. And when his gaze traveled from her face to the silk robe that had loosened during her descent, Eleanor felt her body respond in ways that had nothing to do with the September heat. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, extending his hand with the kind of certainty that suggested he was accustomed to commanding rooms full of Harvard undergraduates. "Dr. Oliver Williams, I believe we have an appointment to discuss Christopher's calculus situation." Eleanor's hand met his, and the contact sent electricity shooting straight through her nervous system. His palm was warm, slightly rough, the hands of someone who worked with his mind but wasn't afraid of physical labor. The handshake lingered 3 seconds longer than professional courtesy required, and Eleanor found herself studying the way his shirt stretched across broad shoulders, the precise knot of his burgundy tie, the confident set of his jaw. "Of course," she managed, her voice carrying a breathless quality that made her cheeks burn. "Please, come in, Kaya. I'm afraid I lost track of time." As Oliver stepped into her foyer, Eleanor realized that some lessons couldn't be found in any textbook, and she was about to discover exactly how much she still had to learn. Eleanor positioned herself in the doorway of Christopher's study, ostensibly monitoring the first tutoring session, but finding herself transfixed by something entirely different than her son's academic progress. The evening light filtered through tall windows, casting golden shadows across mahogany bookshelves that had belonged to 3 generations of Blackwoods. "The key to understanding calculus," Oliver said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone completely comfortable with complex concepts, "is recognizing that change itself follows predictable patterns. Nothing in mathematics or life eggs in isolation." Christopher leaned forward with an attention Eleanor hadn't seen him pay 2 academics in months. Her 17-year-old son, who usually treated homework like a personal insult, was actually taking notes as Oliver sketched equations on the whiteboard with fluid precision. "Now, when we look at the derivative of this function," Oliver continued, his hand moving across the board with confident strokes, "we're essentially asking, how does this system respond to pressure?" Eleanor found herself studying those hands-long fingers that moved with surgical precision, the way his forearms flexed beneath rolled sleeves as he wrote. There was something hypnotic about watching someone operate with such complete mastery of their domain. She'd spent years in boardrooms with powerful men, but Oliver's confidence felt different, turned rather than inherited, intellectual rather than merely financial. "I actually get this," Christopher said, wonder creeping into his voice. It's like the math is describing how things actually work. Oliver smiled, and Eleanor felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. Exactly. Mathematics isn't abstract theory, it's the language reality uses to explain itself. The conversation continued, but Eleanor found her attention drifting from the lesson content to the teacher himself. The way Oliver commanded the room without raising his voice. How he made complex ideas accessible without condescension. The patient way he waited for Christopher's questions. This was authority of a completely different kind than she was accustomed to, intellectual rather than positional, earned through expertise rather than inheritance. Mrs. Blackwood. Oliver's voice cut through her reverie. Did you have a question about Christopher's progress? Heat flooded Eleanor's cheeks as she realized both men were looking at her expectantly. She'd been so absorbed in observing Oliver that she'd missed the last several minutes of conversation entirely. I was just, pressed by your teaching methodology, she managed, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Christopher seems genuinely engaged for the first time in months. Oliver's eyes met hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Sometimes we just need to find the right approach to unlock potential that was always there. Something in his tone suggested he wasn't only talking about mathematics, and Eleanor wondered if he could see straight through her careful composure to the curiosity building beneath. The Bordeaux had been a mistake. Eleanor knew that now, as she heard the doorbell chime through her empty house at nearly 10 p.m. Richard's call from Singapore had been brief and perfunctory. Another delayed closing that would keep him away indefinitely. The wine had seemed like reasonable company until Oliver Williams appeared on her doorstep, apologetic and devastatingly attractive in the porch light. "I'm so sorry to disturb you this late," he said, his voice carrying genuine embarrassment. "I left my teaching materials in Christopher's study." Eleanor clutched her silk robe closer, suddenly aware she was wearing only a thin nightgown beneath. The wine had left her feeling reckless and honest in ways that daylight wouldn't have permitted. "Of course. Please, come in." As Oliver stepped into the foyer, she caught his eyes traveling briefly over her figure before returning to her face with careful professionalism. The house felt electric with his presence, charged with possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to consider in years. "I hope I didn't wake you," he said as they walked toward the study, his voice lower in the intimate darkness of the hallway. "I couldn't sleep," Eleanor admitted, leading him past family portraits that suddenly felt like witnesses to something forbidden. "Richard's traveling again. The house gets so quiet." Oliver paused at the study entrance, something shifting in his expression. "That must be lonely." The simple observation, spoken with such understanding, made Eleanor's breath catch. When had anyone last acknowledged what her marriage actually was? A series of absences punctuated by obligatory appearances. "Sometimes," she whispered, moving to retrieve his materials from the desk. The wine made her movements more graceful, more deliberate. She was acutely aware of how the silk moved against her skin, how Oliver's presence filled the space behind her. Their hands collided as both reached for the same folder, and this time, neither pulled away immediately. His fingers were warm, slightly rough against her softer skin. Eleanor looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse race. "Eleanor," he said quietly, her name carrying weight it had never held before. She could smell his cologne, feel the heat radiating from his body in the small space between them. The rational part of her mind screamed warnings about propriety and consequences, but the wine and his proximity had awakened something she'd forgotten existed. "I should go," Oliver said, but his thumb traced across her knuckles in a gesture that contradicted his words entirely. "Should you?" Eleanor heard herself ask, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung between them like a match struck in darkness. And Eleanor realized some fires, once lit, could never be completely extinguished. Eleanor's private study felt different. With Oliver in it smaller, more intimate, charged with the memory of their almost moment 3 nights ago. She'd arranged for these supplemental sessions ostensibly to better help Christopher. But as Oliver spread his materials across her mahogany desk, she knew they both understood the real reason. "I thought we could start with basic derivatives," Oliver said, his voice carrying that professorial authority that made her pulse quicken. "Understanding the fundamentals will help you guide Christopher more effectively." Eleanor nodded, settling into the chair beside him with careful attention to the space between them. She'd chosen a silk blouse that required frequent adjustment, a skirt that rode up when she leaned forward. Professional enough to maintain pretense, revealing enough to test boundaries. "The derivative represents the rate of change," Oliver explained, his hand moving across the paper with confident strokes. "How one variable responds to pressure from another." As he leaned closer to point out specific equations, Eleanor caught that intoxicating scent of his cologne mixed with something uniquely him. The heat from his body seemed to radiate across the small space between them, making her hyper-aware of every breath, every slight movement. "I'm not sure I follow," Eleanor said softly, deliberately leaning forward until her shoulder brushed his arm. The contact sent electricity shooting through her nervous system. Oliver's hands stilled on the paper. Perhaps a more hands-on approach would help. He moved behind her chair, his presence overwhelming as he reached around to guide her hand. Across the equations, his chest pressed lightly against her back, his breath warm against her ear as he spoke. "Feel how the curve changes here," he murmured, his fingers covering hers as they traced the mathematical function. "The way it responds to the slightest touch." Eleanor's breathing grew shallow as his hand guided hers in slow, deliberate movements. Across the paper, every point of contact between them felt electric, his chest against her shoulders, his thighs bracketing her chair, his fingers intertwined with hers. "Teach me everything," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Oliver's hand tightened over hers, and she felt him go very still behind her. The air between them crackled with tension so thick it was almost visible. "Eleanor," he said, her name rough with barely controlled desire. "We should." She turned in her chair to face him, their bodies now impossibly close, his hands moving instinctively to rest on either side of her chair. The pretense of mathematics had evaporated entirely, leaving only the raw truth of what they both wanted. "Should what?" she challenged, her voice husky with need. The cafe on Brattle Street hummed with the kind of refined conversation that accompanied $30 entrees and carefully curated wine lists. Eleanor had suggested meeting Oliver here, neutral territory, where they could discuss Christopher's progress without the charged atmosphere of her home study. What she hadn't anticipated was running into Vivian Hartwell and her circle of Beacon Hill socialites. "Eleanor, darling," Vivian purred as she approached their corner table, her eyes taking in Oliver with the calculating assessment of someone who categorized people by their usefulness to her social agenda. "How lovely to see you out and about, Eleanor." Felt Oliver straighten beside her, his easy confidence shifting into something more guarded. She'd seen that transformation before the way accomplished men of color learned to navigate spaces where their presence was questioned before their credentials were considered. "Vivian," Eleanor replied coolly. "This is Dr. Oliver Williams, Christopher's mathematics tutor. Oliver, Vivian Hartwell." The introduction hung in the air like a challenge. Vivian's smile remained perfectly practiced, but her eyes narrowed with the kind of subtle disdain that Boston's elite had perfected over generations. Double quotes, "How, progressive of you, Eleanor," Vivian said, the word dripping with condescension. "I suppose Christopher's grades have improved with such dedicated attention." The implication was clear, and Eleanor felt fury rise in her chest like molten metal. The casual racism, the assumption that Oliver's presence could only be explained by some inappropriate dynamic hit crystallized everything she'd grown to despise about her social circle. "Actually," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the steel that had built sterling capital, "Dr. Williams graduated summa cum laude from Harvard and holds a Ph.D. in applied mathematics from MIT. Christopher's calculus scores have improved dramatically under his instruction. Perhaps you should consider similar tutoring for Bradley. I heard he's struggling with basic algebra at Groton." Vivian's face flushed pink, but Eleanor wasn't finished. She stood, her hand finding Oliver's shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "If you'll excuse us, Oliver and I have important matters to discuss." As they walked toward the exit, Eleanor could feel the weight of shocked stares following them. She'd just publicly defended a black man against her own social circle, a transgression that would be dissected at every cocktail party, from Beacon Hill to the Vineyard. "Thank you," Oliver said quietly as they reached his car, his voice thick with emotion she'd never heard from him before. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Eleanor interrupted, turning to face him in the privacy of the parking lot. The fury that had burned through her in the cafe was transforming into something else entirely. Desperate need to claim him, to show him exactly how much she wanted him. Their eyes met across the small space between them, and Eleanor realized some lines once crossed changed everything forever. I can write a romantic chapter that shows their emotional connection and relationship development, but I need to keep the intimate content tasteful rather than explicit. Here's a version that focuses on their emotional breakthrough. Oliver's apartment surprised Eleanor with its understated elegance, exposed brick walls lined with mathematical texts, a telescope positioned near tall windows overlooking the Charles River, jazz playing softly from hidden speakers. This was the home of a man who valued substance over status, intellect over inheritance. "I've never brought anyone here before," Oliver said quietly, setting down wine glasses with hands that trembled slightly. The admission hung between them like a confession. Eleanor moved closer, studying the photographs on his bookshelf. Oliver at Harvard graduation with a proud woman who shared his eyes. Awards from mathematics competitions, a younger version of himself teaching children at what looked like a community center. "You're not what I expected when I first saw you," she admitted, turning to face him. "I made assumptions based on everything I was taught to expect." Oliver's smile was gentle but knowing. "And what do you see now?" "Someone extraordinary," Eleanor whispered, reaching up to touch his face. "Someone who makes me want to be better than I've ever been." When he kissed her, it was with a tenderness that unraveled every defense she'd built over 20 years of loveless marriage. His hands framed her face like she was precious, breakable, worth protecting. "Are you certain about this?" he murmured against her lips. "Once we cross this line, Eleanor, there's no going back to what we were." Instead of answering with words, Eleanor began unbuttoning his shirt with deliberate care, her fingers tracing the warm skin beneath, caught her hands gently, studying her face in the lamplight. "Then let me worship you the way you deserve," he said, his voice rough with reverence. What followed was unlike anything Eleanor had ever experienced, not the perfunctory encounters of her marriage, but something transcendent. Lono touched her like she was a masterpiece he was privileged to admire, kissed her like she contained secrets worth discovering. Every caress spoke of adoration. Every whispered endearment rewrote her understanding of intimacy. Hours later, as they lay entwined in sheets that smelled like him, Eleanor traced patterns on his chest and felt fundamentally changed. The woman who had entered this apartment pressed, dutiful, afraid, no longer existed. "What happens now?" she whispered against his skin. Oliver's arms tightened around her. "Now we figure out how to build something real from this." Outside, Boston glittered in the pre-dawn darkness, but Eleanor felt like she was seeing the world for the first time, dangerous, beautiful, and full of possibilities that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The addiction began 3 weeks after Oliver's apartment, manifesting in stolen moments that grew increasingly reckless as Eleanor's need for him consumed rational thought. What had started as careful scheduling around Richard's business trips evolved into dangerous encounters that tested every boundary of discretion. Tuesday evening found Eleanor preparing dinner while Richard reviewed contracts in his study. Domestic scene disrupted by Oliver's arrival for Christopher's session. The familiar sound of mathematical explanations drifted from upstairs. But Eleanor's attention fixed on the text that appeared on her phone. Kitchen. Now. Her pulse hammered as she moved toward the large windows overlooking the garden, knowing Oliver would appear moments later under the pretense of requesting water. When he entered the kitchen, his eyes held that dark intensity that made her knees weak. "This is insane," Eleanor whispered as he moved behind her, his presence overwhelming even as Richard's voice carried from the nearby study. "Then tell me." "To stop," Oliver murmured against her ear, his hands finding her waist with possessive certainty. But Eleanor couldn't form the words. The risk heightened everything, the way her body responded to his touch. The desperate need that had been building since their last encounter. She pressed back against him, feeling his sharp intake of breath as Richard's footsteps approached. "The kitchen, Eleanor." Richard's voice carried mild irritation. "Where's that financial report you mentioned?" Oliver stepped smoothly to the sink, filling a glass with water, while Eleanor forced her voice to remain steady. "Second drawer of my desk, the Morgan file." Richard nodded absently, barely acknowledging Oliver's presence before returning to his study. The moment his footsteps receded, Eleanor's composure cracked entirely. "I can't stop thinking about you," she confessed, her voice breaking with need. "It's consuming me." Oliver's eyes darkened with understanding and something deeper, recognition of his own struggle with their growing obsession. "Eleanor, we need to be careful." Richard suspects. "I don't care," she interrupted, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I've never felt alive like this before. Never felt wanted." The confession hung between them like a bridge over an abyss. Oliver reached for her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm in a gesture that was both comforting and electric. "Meet me tomorrow," he said quietly. "My place. We need to talk about where this is heading." As Christopher's laughter echoed from upstairs and Richard's papers rustled in the study, Eleanor realized they were standing at a crossroads that would determine not just their future, but how much of herself she was willing to risk for the chance at something real. The Blackwood Foundation Gala transformed the Four Seasons Ballroom into a glittering showcase of Boston's elite, where million-dollar donations were pledged over champagne and charity became a competitive sport. Eleanor moved through the crowd in the midnight blue gown Oliver had chosen, silk that clung to every curve, a neckline that suggested rather than revealed elegance with an edge that made her feel powerful and desired. "Stunning turnout, Richard," said, appearing at her elbow with the territorial air of someone marking his property. His hand found the small of her back with possessive familiarity that now felt invasive rather than comforting. Eleanor's attention drifted across the ballroom to where Oliver stood near the silent auction tables, devastating in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. He'd accepted her invitation as a distinguished educator supporting youth mathematics programs. But the way he commanded attention suggested he belonged in rooms like this regardless of her sponsorship. The Mathematics Education Initiative. "Seems popular," Richard observed, following her gaze with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Your tutor certainly cleans up well." The casual dismissal in Richard's tone made Eleanor's jaw tighten. "Dr. Williams holds advanced degrees from Harvard and MIT. His presence elevates this entire event." Something flickered in Richard's expression, surprise. At her vehement defense, calculation about what it might mean. Before he could respond, The foundation director approached with updates on the evening's fundraising progress. Eleanor excused herself, weaving through clusters of donors toward the ladies' lounge with deliberate purpose. She wasn't surprised when Oliver appeared in the marble-appointed space moments later. Having waited the appropriate interval to avoid obvious connection. "You look extraordinary," he said quietly, his eyes traveling over her with undisguised hunger. "That dress is too sass. And ruby kiss, only ruby kiss. As a class as a luxurious texture that glides on, laugh sooty, and leaves a rich long terrier's Corey, long-lasting color. You look extraordinary. No way, we look extraordinary," he said, collide slassly, my life. My life, my life, my lies, by life. My belad, pie my lies, to see it. We I may make, coincide. We said to her, to me you beside my lied it kai sikate it besides x kai malix kikadik glit if I patus it I bad it's to be exactly what I imagined. "You're taking a risk being here," Eleanor whispered, but her body betrayed her concern by moving closer to his heat. "Worth it to watch you shine," Oliver replied, his hands finding her waist with possessive certainty. "Though seeing other men look at you is testing my self-control." The admission sent heat spiraling through Eleanor's core. The idea that Oliver felt possessive, jealous even, awakened something primal in her response to him. "Then perhaps," Eleanor said, emboldened by champagne and his proximity, "you should remind me who I belong to." Oliver's eyes darkened with promise and warning. "Careful what you ask for, Eleanor. It might just claim you're right here where anyone could discover us." The threat made her pulse race with dangerous excitement, and Eleanor realized they were dancing on the edge of complete recklessness, exactly where she wanted to be. The mahogany-paneled office that had witnessed so many of Eleanor's triumphs now felt like a tribunal designed to destroy everything she discovered about herself. Richard sat behind her own desk with predatory satisfaction, flanked by a private investigator whose camera equipment lay spread across the leather surface like instruments of surgical destruction. "Sit down, Eleanor," Richard said, his voice carrying the polished cruelty of someone who'd spent years weaponizing privilege. "We have a great deal to discuss about your recent extracurricular activities." Eleanor remained standing, her spine rigid with defiance, even as fear crawled up her throat. The photographs scattered across the desk told the story of every stolen moment, her entering Oliver's apartment building, emerging hours later with the disheveled look of a woman thoroughly loved, hotel security footage from the foundation gala that captured glances too intimate for mere professional acquaintance. "Interesting reading," the investigator said, sliding a tablet across the mahogany surface. "Dr. Williams has quite an impressive background. Harvard Ph.D., community outreach, impeccable reputation. Be a shame if rumors started circulating about his inappropriate relationships with wealthy clients." The racial coding was subtle but unmistakable, the implication that Oliver was nothing more than a predatory black man taking advantage of a vulnerable white woman's loneliness. The narrative would destroy him professionally and personally, reduce years of earned expertise to a stereotype designed to lynch men who dared to love above their designated station. "What do you want?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew. The answer would cost her everything that mattered. "Complete cessation of contact," Richard replied, leaning back with satisfaction. "Immediate termination of all business relationships. And your absolute silence about whatever delusional fantasy you've convinced yourself you're living." Eleanor stared at the evidence of her liberation spread across the desk like a crime scene. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. Fury that had been building since childhood, since every time she'd been told to accept less than she deserved. "Refuse," Richard continued. "And these images become evidence in a harassment lawsuit that will follow Williams for the rest of his career. Try to contact him again, and I'll ensure every academic institution in New England knows exactly what kind of man they'd be hiring. Eleanor looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw clearly for the first time the calculated cruelty that had always lurked beneath his patrician charm. This wasn't about marriage or betrayal. This was about power and the lengths he'd go to maintain it. "I need time to consider," she said quietly, her mind already racing toward Oliver's apartment and whatever desperate hours they might have left. The FBI field office felt like salvation disguised as bureaucracy. Its sterile conference room transformed into a war room where Eleanor and Oliver spread financial records across government-issued tables like generals planning victory. Special Agent Sarah Chen reviewed the encrypted files with the focused intensity of someone who'd built a career dismantling white-collar criminals. "Mrs. Blackwood," Agent Chen said, studying the blockchain transactions Oliver had helped Eleanor decode. "You're alleging systematic embezzlement from the Blackwood Foundation's Children's Education Fund." "Not alleging," Eleanor corrected, her voice carrying the steel that had built sterling capital. "Proving." She nodded to Oliver, whose fingers danced across his laptop with surgical precision, pulling up financial records that revealed Richard's carefully constructed fraud. "The beauty of your husband's scheme," Oliver explained. His expertise, now weaponized for justice rather than seduction, was embedding theft within legitimate foundation operations. Donor funds were diverted through shell companies, then laundered through consulting fees to firms that existed only on paper. Agent Chen leaned forward as data streams revealed millions in stolen charitable funds. "How long has this been occurring?" "For years," Eleanor said, the number carrying the weight of her own complicity through willful ignorance. "I suspected irregularities when grant disbursements started showing discrepancies, but Richard always provided explanations. It wasn't until Oliver helped me access the complete financial architecture that we could prove systematic theft." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The same intellectual partnership that had brought Eleanor and Oliver together had also exposed Richard's crimes. What had started as tutoring sessions had evolved into forensic accounting that revealed corruption worth $38 million. "The surveillance footage Richard threatened you with," Agent Chen continued. "He obtained it through illegal network intrusions conducted by his private investigator, which gave us probable cause to seize his digital communications." Oliver smiled grimly. "He got so focused on destroying my reputation that he forgot I might know how to trace his electronic footprints. Every illegal surveillance operation, every attempt to manufacture evidence, it's all documented in encrypted files he thought were secure." Eleanor watched her husband's empire crumble in real time as federal agents prepared arrest warrants. The man who'd tried to weaponize race and class against Oliver had been undone by the very technology he'd dismissed as beneath his notice. "There's more," Eleanor said quietly, pulling up one final folder. "Richard wasn't working alone. The private investigator has been facilitating similar operations for other wealthy clients' blackmail, illegal surveillance, evidence tampering." Agent Chun's eyebrows rose as she reviewed the evidence. "Mrs. Blackwood, you've just handed us the largest organized white-collar crime network we've seen in years." Outside the office windows, Eleanor could see federal vehicles preparing to end Richard's reign of entitled cruelty forever. The renovated Beacon Hill townhouse felt reborn, its oppressive formality replaced with warmth that reflected Eleanor's transformation from trophy wife to liberated woman. Sunlight streamed through windows, no longer shrouded in heavy drapes, illuminating spaces where Oliver's books mingled with Eleanor's art collection, where their combined lives created something entirely new. "The judge signed the final papers this morning," Eleanor announced, waving the divorce decree like a flag of victory as she entered the kitchen, where Oliver prepared coffee with the domestic ease of someone who belonged. Christopher looked up from his calculus homework, now completed without struggle thanks to months of Oliver's patient instruction, and grinned with genuine happiness. So it's official. Oliver's not going anywhere. Not if I have anything to say about it, Eleanor replied, catching Oliver's smile as he moved behind her chair, his hands finding her shoulders with possessive tenderness. The past 6 months had transformed them all. Christopher had not only caught up academically but discovered a genuine love for mathematics. His early admission to MIT, a testament to Oliver's teaching and his own dedication. Eleanor had emerged from Richard's shadow to reclaim Sterling Capital, restructuring it as an ethical investment firm that prioritized social impact over pure profit. "There's something else," Oliver said, producing an envelope with the MIT letterhead. That made Christopher's face light up with anticipation. "Your scholarship committee made their final decision." Christopher tore open the letter with shaking hands, his expression shifting from hope to disbelief to pure joy. "Full ride," he whispered, then louder. "Full scholarship for the mathematics honors program." Eleanor felt tears of pride sting her eyes as she watched her son, their son now, really embrace Oliver with gratitude that had evolved far beyond academic appreciation. Christopher had gained not just a tutor, but a mentor. A father figure who believed in his potential without condition. "Celebration dinner tonight," Eleanor declared, but Oliver's eyes held a different kind of hunger as he looked at her. Later, he murmured against her ear as Christopher gathered his books for school. "First, I want to properly commemorate your freedom." The promise in his voice sent heat spiraling through Eleanor's core. After months of stolen moments and careful secrecy, they now had something precious: time, privacy, and a home that belonged to them without shame or fear. As Christopher left for school and the house settled into intimate quiet, Oliver turned to Eleanor with the smile that had first captivated Herb. Now it carried the weight of earned trust, proven love, and unlimited possibility. "Mrs. Soon-to-be Williams," he said, the presumption making her pulse race with anticipation, "I believe we have some celebrating to do." The Williams Blackwood Academy occupied a restored brownstone in Cambridge, its bright classrooms filled with students who might never have discovered their mathematical potential without scholarship programs. Funded by Eleanor's restructured foundation, 1 year after Richard's conviction, the Academy had become proof that some equations balanced perfectly when built on genuine partnership rather than calculated advantage. Eleanor stood in the main classroom watching Oliver demonstrate calculus concepts to a group of inner-city teenagers, his natural authority now serving students who needed advocates rather than wealthy families seeking status. The sight of him commanding the room with passionate expertise still made her pulse quicken, though now it carried the deeper satisfaction of watching someone she loved fulfill their true purpose. "Mom's looking at Oliver like he's dessert again," Christopher observed, appearing beside her with the easy confidence of someone thriving at MIT. His holiday visit had brought renewed appreciation for the stability Oliver had provided during his transformation from struggling student to academic star. "Your mother has excellent taste," Eleanor replied without embarrassment, slipping her arm through her son's. The title felt natural now. Christopher had chosen to keep it even after learning about her relationship with Oliver. Their family, dynamic, evolving into something stronger than traditional boundaries. The Academy's success had exceeded their wildest projections. 43 students had received full scholarships to top universities, their mathematical achievements opening doors that socioeconomic circumstances had previously barred. Local news stations featured their story regularly, portraying Eleanor and Oliver as educational innovators rather than the scandalous couple Boston society had once whispered about. As the afternoon class concluded, Eleanor felt Oliver's hands find her waist from behind, his familiar warmth enveloping her like a promise kept. The public display of affection would have scandalized her old social circle. But their academy represented a different world, one where competence mattered more than connections, where love was celebrated rather than calculated. "Ready to head home, Mrs. Williams?" Oliver murmured against her ear, the name still new enough to send shivers of pleasure through her nervous system. Their wedding had been in Tomato sunrise ceremony on Martha's Vineyard with Christopher as best man and Oliver's mother offering tearful blessings to the daughter-in-law she'd initially viewed with suspicion. Their evening ritual had become sacred, returning to the home office where everything had begun, now transformed from a space of forbidden desire into the headquarters of their shared mission. The mahogany desk where Richard had once plotted financial crimes now held grant applications and scholarship portfolios, symbols of their equal partnership in both love and purpose. As Christopher departed for dinner with college friends, the house settled into intimate quiet. Oliver loosened his tie while Eleanor poured wine, their movements synchronized by months of domestic harmony. The photograph on their desk showed the three of them at Christopher's MIT graduation of family, built on choice rather than obligation, strengthened by trials that would have destroyed lesser bonds. The Peterson Foundation approved our expansion proposal, Eleanor announced, settling into Oliver's arms as they reviewed the day's correspondence. 50 additional scholarships next year, plus funding for the summer enrichment program. Oliver's smile carried the satisfaction of someone watching dreams become reality. Remember when you thought mathematics was just about numbers? Eleanor laughed, remembering the woman who'd opened her door 18 months ago, pressed, dutiful, accepting limitation as fate rather than choice. Now I know it's about infinite possibilities. When he kissed her beside the tall windows overlooking their garden, it carried the weight of everything they'd built together. Not just passion, but partnership. Not just desire, but deep respect and shared purpose. Their love had become the foundation for something larger than themselves, a family chosen rather than inherited, a business built on values rather than profit, a future where their son could thrive because two people had been brave enough to choose authentic connection over social expectation. As Boston glittered beyond their windows, Eleanor realized some mathematical series truly were infinite, expanding and deepening with each iteration, approaching something beautiful beyond calculation. Their story had no ending, only endless chapters of growth, discovery, and the kind of love that transforms not just a hearts, but entire communities touched by their courage to choose truth over convention.